as regular listeners and or viewers of the program know, we have had a correspondent in Puerto Rico, and he is about to leave as we record this. So we're going to get one final report from him. Alexander Zaitchik, our reporter on the ground, is a journalist. He is the author of several books, the most recent of which is Out of the Ooze, the story of Dr. Tom Price for Strong Arm Press. So first of all, Alex, thanks for coming back on the program.
Good to be here, as always.
Good. Now, as you get ready to board a plane there, question number one, did you run into any situations or aspects of this story that you didn't expect and that you thought maybe deserved a little bit more amplification in the public awareness?
Well, I mean, to be honest, it's still very much about just sort of immediate relief efforts. Even when you hear stories about some of the human tragedies at the sort of granular level, you're never quite prepared to see it. I found myself in a couple rooms with people who, didn't have electricity for their, feeding tubes that required pumps, and they were basically starving to death, in or within a range of the capital city, which is just, a shocking thing to see. There's generators around, but they're not always enough to go everywhere they need to be. The hospitals were still, very much in a state of chaos, people being, turned away, people with life-threatening situations, even in San Juan. So it was pretty grim. And as late as this week, there was still flash flooding and a lot of rain that was hampering relief efforts both around San Juan and especially in the remoter provinces in the center of the country. So, there's so many stories here that deserve attention. It's hard to even really know where to begin. And then, of course, there's the larger picture stuff like the debt issue, which I encountered in a pretty visceral way. The last couple of days, I was in these communities collectively known as El Caño, these 8 barrios around the Martin Peña Channel, sort of running west to east through central San Juan. And they've been waiting for a dredging operation in the canal that runs through these communities. And one of the reasons it hasn't happened over the decades is because of the debt and the financial crisis that Puerto Rico is in. And it was an interesting place to watch a sort of environmental justice story turn into a climate justice story, as mega storms tend to do. I mean, they've been saying for years, we need to dredge this canal because it's clogged, and every time it rains for 3 hours, it's flooding our communities, and we don't have adequate plumbing because they're poor communities, and it backs up the wastewater, and we're getting sick. And of course, when Irma and Maria hit, the flooding there was absolutely apocalyptic, 10 feet and up in some cases. And, this is going to be more and more frequent in the 21st century. So now these communities are sort of saying, tragically, we told you so. We're talking about 3.5 miles of dredging, and the Army Corps of Engineers have been making excuses about why they can't do it. And now they're facing these existential, threats. These 2,000 families in the middle of the city. So that's one story that I'm hoping to sort of dig into and tell a little bit more fully.
Yeah, I really think that's an important story, and I hope you do that. I also think that, there's going to be somebody listening to this program who hears you mention the Army Corps of Engineers and has a little kind of jolt of what does the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers have to do with it? So for that listener or two, since most of our listeners are politically aware on this program, just to remind you, we are talking about the United States here. We are talking, Puerto Rico is the United States, and while that kind of horror should never happen to any human being anywhere, we're actually talking about the country that most listeners of this program live in, and it's so important to talk about that and to talk about the fact that there be the people in this in the neighborhoods you describe are being hit three ways. First, by the climate change knowingly brought on by corporations like ExxonMobil and so on, Coke Industries. Secondly, by the financial takeover of Puerto Rico by exploitative, greedy, extractive bankers, which prevents the dredging from taking place that they need, not to mention the systematic poverty there. And thirdly, by the hurricane that then comes in and the lack of response to it because of the same financial and political and environmental pressures. So I really think that's kind of a ground zero for what we're struggling against. So as horrific as their experience is, I'm glad you were there to witness it, and I think it's important that we talk about it. So thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah, absolutely. My pleasure.
And then what else you got? Yeah,
what else I got?
Not to put you on the spot, but
that's interesting is as FEMA has been kind of not on the ground in a lot of places, and it's worth mentioning that people aren't necessarily angry at FEMA, even if they think they should have been more present with more services, because they understand that, I mean, FEMA was basically stretched incredibly thin by the time Maria hit Puerto Rico. They were at something like 15% capacity. So they're outsourcing a lot of their work to local community development organizations and local activists who are a little bit upset about that because they're on the hook now with their communities about delivering things. So, you know, FEMA will give them applications for tarps or generators or emergency supplies, but they won't say when it's going to be coming in. So these groups, which have spent years and decades building trust with the communities, are suddenly, you know, the ones on the hook for delivering. And they think, in many cases, people I've talked to, that the FEMA is putting them in a really bad situation, especially because they haven't really been giving any hard promises about when this stuff is going to show up. And they have almost, this is really interesting, I think, they have almost no Spanish language staff in Puerto Rico. At their main office, they had something like 25 people, and there were 2 Spanish speakers among them all. I mean, it's pretty incredible when you think about it.
You're talking about FEMA now. Yeah.
They're, asking that people speak English when FEMA staff go out to the communities, or they have a translator at the ready, which of course is not something that's always available to people. And they're using iPad applications for some relief requests. And of course, there's no Wi-Fi on the island in most places. So there's some of the FEMA stuff has been pretty amazing to hear about, how an organization based on the idea of effective disaster response can be so utterly clueless and unprepared to work in a Spanish-speaking population. So that's definitely been striking.
You know, and that's also, by the way, an extremely important story for a lot of reasons. It brings a couple things to mind, Alex. Zaitchik. One is what I read about the groups that went in, the U.S. government groups that went in after the invasion of Iraq, and had no idea, had no Arabic speakers, had no comprehension of the kind of technological state or physical state of the post-war situation they were going into. Again, utterly clueless, as if they'd never been off their own college campus or something.
Yeah, I mean, Arabic is one thing, but I mean, Spanish. It's a bilingual country, for Christ's sake. You'd think FEMA would have some Spanish speakers. Yeah, especially for a Puerto Rico mission.
Right, there is a broad pool of people in North America and Puerto Rico to draw from on that one. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I was thinking more of the overall incompetence.
Sure.
Yeah. And the second,
and one thing that's been interesting is filling the void of the federal response has been some really inspiring just citizen volunteers I've met along the way. Like, I met a guy from Alaska, diagonally as far away from Puerto Rico as you can get in U.S. territory. Just showed up with like 25 chainsaws and is off doing what they're calling work brigades every day, just helping farmers and people clear trees off roads and in rural areas and get their land back to being productive or whatever it may be. A lot of that, a lot of those stories of people just showing up and, spending their disability checks or savings or whatever it may be with stuff and just doing it on their own because they show up at the FEMA volunteer office and they're basically, useless, and they just, they have to go off and find their own connections with organizations on the ground, these sort of self-organizing, very bottom-up relief efforts that aren't tied to any state or federal agency at all, and they're just finding a way to get stuff done. So there's a lot of that, and Americans I've met from all over the country just showing up, trying to help, often having spent a ton of money on equipment, whether it be generators or chainsaws, like this guy from Alaska.
Yeah, and I'm very interested, as you know, and I know you are too, in self-organizing situations after a crisis. We saw some of that as well after Katrina too. We had a collective come together and some other groups. In this case, I think it's even more urgently needed. And before we go off the topic of FEMA incompetence, I would remind people that FEMA has had until recently 8 years under President Obama to get its act together. So, it's striking to me that there's a sort of bipartisan record of incompetence when it comes to making sure that this particular part of the United States is adequately covered. And congressional obstinance and unwillingness to budget is part of it, but it also seems like a kind of neglect from both parties in Washington, D.C. Maybe I'm being too tough on the Democrats. I don't know, but it seems to me it should be more together than it is.
Yeah, and, again, granted, they were stretched thin. It was an exceptionally difficult season for them, but if nothing else, this should serve as a wake-up call that this particular federal agency needs to be expanded and boosted with steroids, because this is going to become more and more the norm, not the exception.
Yeah. Any further thoughts on self-organizing communities, spontaneous communities, I guess? Any other observations there?
Well, yeah. I mean, the one thing that storms like this really bring out better than anything is that those communities that are already doing that are the ones that are most resilient, to use a kind of catchphrase that's starting to catch on as we talk more and more about climate adaptation and community resiliency. Those are the communities that do better in disasters, ones that have, set up structures to begin with, and leaders in place, and youth groups and outreach efforts, and that have kind of taken control, with various forms of popular local democracy already. When crises and emergencies hit, they do better, and they're able to respond, as opposed to those that have not been developing those mechanisms prior. And it really just brings it out when you see those communities like the ones I mentioned along the channel. They've been working on these EJ issues for a long time, and they were very tight-knit, very educated, and, organized, and they have a sense of how to get their voice heard, and now they're seizing the moment to sort of amplify their message in the context of, what are going to be more and more megastorms like this, and even accentuating the importance of equitable planning and providing basic infrastructure for the whole city, including its poor neighborhoods and residents.
Right, and the whole island, of course. So, one last question for you, Alex. Were the people welcoming to you? Did you feel comfortable where you went, or was there resentment? Was there suspicion? What was the vibe?
No. Everyone is. I mean, it's incredibly, warm and welcoming place, and even with the grimness of the situation, people were very, very welcoming, and I wouldn't describe it as like a sort of a happy moment in Puerto Rico, obviously, but nothing but sort of open-hearted and accepting environment, for sure. There's not really a whole lot of bandwidth for negativity. Even when Trump came and made his ludicrous appearance and shot paper towels, people just kind of shrugged it off and were like, yeah, we don't have time for that right now. Just kind of ignore it.
Yeah, I wish we could all do that. So, all right. Well, listen, you've done great work down there. I know you got a plane to catch, so we'll let you go. But Alexander Zaitchik, journalist and 0 Hour correspondent in Puerto Rico. Thanks for going down there, and thanks for talking to us.
Thank you, RJ.